second assessment report on cities and climate change, which is to be published, I think, in the end of this year, isn't it, Stelios?
Right.
To you
Yeah,
the floor.
it will be launched in COP21 in Paris.
Okay, so next month, more or less.
Yeah.
Okay, so Stelios, to you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Margareta, for the kind introduction. I would like also to thank the organizers for inviting me to this series of webinars. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here with you. So today I'm going to talk on urban climate resilience and decision making with focus on water. And the outline of this webinar, of my talk, we'll start with contextualizing urban climate adaptation and resilience. Then we will move to the introduction to multiple criteria analysis, and then we're going to illustrate the MCA application through a case study in the city of Dhaka. And we will close with some applications of MCA in the context of climate change and resilience and some lessons learned. So to start with, it's important to understand the dynamics of increasing urbanization and also climate change issues and understand the risk in urban and rural areas. As we know already, since 2011, the world we live is highly urbanized, and half of the global population lives already in cities. And according to projections from UN Habitat and other UN organizations, it is expected in 2030 that 60% of global population will live in cities, which implies more accumulation of people and assets in urban areas, which would determine to a large extent also and imply a higher risk, taking into account the accelerated climate change impacts and extreme weather events. So we have a natural growth of urbanization, migration from rural to urban areas, and therefore accumulation of populations and assets in urban areas, which normally, in cases that this is not a well-planned and managed urbanization process, often we see mega cities, particularly in low and middle income countries, becoming hotspots of risk. To name a few, the Dhaka in Bangladesh, we're going to focus also on the case study, but also other cities in Southeast Asia and Africa. In addition to that, we see more and more development of small cities and towns that they have less resources and poor planning and services, and therefore those medium-sized towns and cities might face also issues related to climate change impacts. And of course, we have peri-urban, random, and fast transformation of land use and populations happening. While talking about increased urbanization and climate change issues and extreme events that will be accelerated in the near and long future, it's important to understand and define the issue of urban resilience. IPCC, in the most recent assessment report, defines resilience as the ability of socio-ecological or socio-ecological system and its component parts to anticipate, absorb, accommodate, or recover from the effects of a hazardous event in a timely and efficient manner, including through ensuring the preservation, restoration, or improvement of its essential basic structures and functions, its capacity for self-organization, and the capacity to adapt to stress and change. This is an important evolution of the issue of resilience, as there are different organizations scientists and researchers that try to contextualize urban resilience or urban climate resilience in order to understand and try to measure also. From the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, the main components of resilience are redundancy, flexibility, capacity to reorganize, and capacity to learn. So we see also that the issue of resilience is directly linked with issues of reorganization, learning, and evolution of the system in order to be able to absorb external shocks. Another attempt to define urban resilience is a recent initiative from Rockefeller Foundation, the 100 Resilient Cities, and the main components of this framework are health and well-being, economy and society, leadership and strategy, infrastructure and environment, and have identified also sub-components and sub-indicators to be able to measure the level of resilience in different cities. I'm presenting these different types of approaches of defining resilience to also to illustrate the challenge to understand on one hand, and secondly to contextualize in different cases and translate that in measurable indicators. Going further to this evolution of the term resilience, Tyler and Munch have been defining the resilient climate resilient cities and have added issues related to agents and institutions. So apart from the urban system, is important to take into account agents that interact with each other and affect that system, but also institutions that steer and regulate the overall framework where this system and agents are operating. So this is quite important to understand the complexity of resilience and the challenge really to translate to measurable indicators and eventually really to understand and assess climate adaptation or resilience actions and their impact. In this regard, and talking about climate change, adaptation and resilience, is also important to understand the differences between adaptation and mitigation, and particularly with regard to their spatial and temporal scales. When a mitigation action is undertaking, the benefits by reducing greenhouse gas emissions will be realized in the medium or long term and will be realized also at a global scale. So reducing a ton of CO2 here will have the same impact if we reduce a ton of CO2 in US or Asia or elsewhere. So we're talking about a global scale of mitigation here. Whereas adaptation is something that tries to tackle the issues of climate change impacts realized at the local or national level, and we see responses taken at the national or local level, whereas the benefits of adaptation actions will be realized in the near future, addressing climate risk, or in the medium term. So, and focusing on adaptation spatial scales, we have different scales like global, national, and local, and how adaptation has been attempted to be assessed and integrated in decision making. At the global level, we have integrated assessment models or general equilibrium models that to a large extent are top-down approaches and integrate economics, and to which extent is more beneficial to adapt now or to adapt in the future. But those approaches are pretty much top-down modeling approaches, whereas we have at the national level the National Adaptation Program of Actions that this is a kind of condition for provided by UNFCCC for national governments to develop their national adaptation program of actions in order to be able to access finance for their adaptation actions. And at the local level, we see more and more initiatives taken from local governments, and more assessments being conducted at the local level with regard to vulnerability assessment, but also with regard to adaptation measures assessment, and this is where our talk will focus. But here, according to IPCC, I would like briefly to introduce the adaptation assessment challenges and some main characteristics. One of those is the issue of uncertainty. Uncertainty with regard to climate impacts, to climate models, but also with regard to local economic development, and also uncertainty with regard to human behavior and human preferences. Then the issue of co-benefits. So what type of additional benefits any adaptation actions might generate? This is an important aspect, particularly for local governments. If local benefits are quite significant, then this would really make the adaptation actions more justifiable. So the issue of co-benefits, also with regard to co-benefits on mitigation, so having an adaptation measure that could also have reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, or other local sustainability benefits, are important aspects to take into account and into the decision-making process. And it's quite challenging, of course, to incorporate all those multiple benefits. And the third point here, which is important for adaptation assessment, is the issue of inclusion for different reasons. First of all, different stakeholders that will be affected by climate impacts or climate adaptation measures decisions should be incorporated in the decision process. And also, it's important to know how the adaptation benefits, so the benefits from adaptation measures, will be distributed in the society. So definitely including stakeholders in the decision making is an important element and quite challenging at the same time. Having introduced the main characteristics and challenges on climate change adaptation assessment, I would like to just introduce the overall picture of climate change action planning process and its components and where exactly we're focusing. So according to UNFCCC, the main steps on climate change action planning process are ex-ante assessment of climate adaptation actions, planning for implementation, the actual implementation, and then monitoring and evaluation. This is another planning cycle that illustrates also the focus of this talk, which is again on identifying and evaluating assessing the different climate change adaptation actions. So at this particular stage of climate adaptation actions assessment, there are different tools that can be used and has been used in order to assess the different actions. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with all of them or some of those methodologies, which are the cost-benefit analysis, measuring costs and benefits of different actions, the cost-effectiveness analysis, measuring the cost and the effectiveness, in our case, the reduction of climate risk and vulnerability, and the multiple criteria analysis, which integrates multiple criteria for assessing different actions. And this is where we are focusing. Multiple criteria analysis, MCA, is rooted in decision analysis, management science, and operational research, and has been already implemented in different fields, on environmental studies, on transport, energy, forestry, urban management applications, and so forth for the last 2 decades already. And there are many methodologies that have been quite sophisticated ones also that have been developed. Which are the main elements of an MCA? First of all, the idea is to compare, measure, and assess multiple options, multiple alternatives, in our case, different climate change adaptation actions, through a set of multiple criteria that often could be conflicting, so meaning increasing the performance of an environmental aspect might cost, so then we'll have a conflict between an environmental and economic criteria. We'll see in more details that through the example. And of course, inclusion of multiple stakeholders, which is an important element that it makes MCA distinct from the cost-benefit analysis and cost-effectiveness analysis. Which are the main steps? First, defining the different actions, alternatives that we want to compare and assess. Then to define the evaluation criteria and objectives, what matters for us, what matters for the assessment process, what matters for the stakeholders that are involved in the decision-making process. Then the next step is to quantify impacts and or assign scores, meaning really to measure the scores and performance of each alternative against each criterion. As you understand here, having multiple criteria that are quite diverse with regard also to their measurement units, we need to apply a technique to translate the different measurement units in one common scale, and this process is called normalization process. Then the next part will be to weight the evaluation criteria. Different criteria might have different importance for the decision makers, or they might have different importance for different stakeholders. So this is an important element, quite subjective, that should be taken into account, and therefore try to model preferences of stakeholders and policymakers within this decision-making assessment technique. And based on this information, practically based on the scores of alternatives against the criteria and the weights that have been assigned by stakeholders to this criteria, then we can rank the different options and see which actions are best to incorporate and introduce to policymaking first and implement first. It's important to emphasize here that stakeholders could be involved in that process in different steps. So defining the different options and defining the criteria and objectives that matter is a way where stakeholders can be involved through stakeholders consultations and workshops and express their preferences. In addition to that, also to weight the evaluation criteria, so to express which criteria are more important than others. On quantifying the impacts, this is quite a meticulous exercise, very technical one, and often is based on modeling or experts' judgments, and therefore experts' inclusion is strongly recommended there. So understanding the overall context of multiple criteria analysis, here we have a very simple example. On the vertical axis we have the different objectives, and that this is quite open for the stakeholders to decide what type of criteria will be included in the assessment process. So here we include what matters in an assessment process, and therefore it's important to include different stakeholders to express their objectives. Then it's important to identify indicators on how to measure those different objectives, and it's important to have a smart selection of indicators that should be understandable, measurable, simple, practical, and so forth. And at the horizontal axis we have the different actions or alternatives, options, and so forth. So this is, we can see this table often as the impact matrix, where each action could be measured against each criterion, and we have an overall picture of how the different actions perform against our criteria. As I said before, the inclusion of stakeholders, it's quite important in the process, particularly also on the weighting part of the criteria, which is quite technical, and this can be also through different workshops, different consultations, and there are different techniques, which is not the scope of this webinar to get into details. And another important element is the inclusion of uncertainty in the analysis and in the decision making, particularly with regard to climate change adaptation issues and actions. As I mentioned before, there are different types of uncertainties that should be taken into account, and MCA could integrate that component either through sensitivity analysis, meaning changing the input variables, in our case are the performances, the scores of the different actions, for instance, to which extent different actions reduce vulnerability, which definitely it's quite uncertain to get the precise information. Therefore, by changing this input variable, we can really understand and by conducting sensitivity analysis, we can really understand to which extent our results are robust on this uncertain level of uncertainty that we define. Another way is by scenario analysis. So we can build different scenarios with regard to vulnerability risk reduction. So scenario analysis can be very well incorporated in MCA. And another way is to implement, to apply an adaptive management approach, meaning whenever we have additional information that provide more insights about the likely impacts or about the likely effects of certain adaptation actions, to always adapt the process and adapt the input variables and therefore the results. So MCA is quite flexible to integrate this adaptive management approach. I would like briefly to illustrate MCA by an application to a flood management issue in the city of Dhaka that we conducted with a couple of colleagues. City of Dhaka, as you know, is prone to floods, intense rainfall during monsoon periods, and suffers often from flood. Also, it's a city that many rivers enter, and therefore flood issue is quite a priority for the city of Dhaka. Here you can see the area, the study area, which is which was highly inundated in past flood incidents, and this is the east part of the area of the city, which is unprotected. So we conducted prioritization and assessment process of different proposals that were put forward from the government, and we applied a multiple criteria analysis where stakeholders and experts were involved in this assessment process through selection of criteria and weighting of criteria, and experts through scoring the different alternatives. We use a tool that we have developed in an MCA tool that we have developed in IHS, the Climate Prior tool. It's a climate actions prioritization tool. We identified with with the policymakers the actions. This was quite straightforward since the government put forward related flood protection measures, ranging from construction of the drainage system, raise of roads, embankment, flood wall, protection of canal, protection of water retention areas, canal improvement, enhancing emergency and upgrading early warning systems. So it's a diversity of structural and non-structural measures. Then with the stakeholders we identified evaluation criteria ranging from vulnerability reduction, the cost of each measure, institutional and technical capacity that was available, public and political acceptance of the different measures, to which extent achievement of MDGs was included, employment generation, if any of the actions generate local jobs, enhancement of ecological conditions. Of course, this was quite challenging to measure, and therefore we used qualitative scales, and we included expert judgments to provide us with more detailed information about how, based on their experience and knowledge, to which extent these different actions meet our criteria. And in 5 out of 7 criteria we use the qualitative scale 1 to 5, 5 as best performance, 1 as the worst performance, so they express the relevant relative performance between the different actions and how they perform against this criteria, whereas we had the cost figures, and we used euros in that case, and also we used a kind of percentage of vulnerability and risk reduction of the area by introducing these measures, which was also conducted by experts. So based on this assessment, we got a first feeling on how the different actions perform against our criteria. So already we can see which actions really meet most of our criteria and to which extent. And in that case, protection of water retention area, upgrading early warning system, enhancing emergency response mechanism shows that outperform the other actions. However, an important element was the weighting of the criteria, and by including different stakeholders through workshops that we organized in the city of Dhaka, we elicited stakeholders' preferences, and through a workshop we had a kind of consensus, reaching consensus on the specific weighting factors, and here are the results with regard to the weights that were elicited. By incorporating both types of information, the scores and the weights, then we, and based on the summation formula, we resulted the final rank of alternatives and the final scores and the final ranking of alternatives, which you could see being illustrated here, having protection of water retention areas as the most preferred option, followed closely by upgrading early warning systems and so forth. What you could see here is also how this final index has been built based on the performance of each action on each criterion. So I think that provides pretty much a good illustration of both type of variables. We conducted also a sensitivity analysis with regard to the weights, and it looks that the results didn't reverse much when we were changing weights. Therefore, we concluded that the results with regard to stakeholders' preferences and weights are quite robust. We see more and more applications of MCA in the literature, and here I have listed some examples from urban applications. Most of them you could see are related to flood management and disaster management, river basin management as well. So to a large extent on water-related issues, since to a large extent water scarcity or flood are climate-induced water issues. Here I would like to illustrate that most of those applications are from researchers, coming from researchers, as you see, and not from practitioners. However, the last years we see also eventually also international organizations really embracing this technique, this approach. We see here UNEP having initiated MCA for Climate, which is a MCA platform online where case studies of applying MCA in adaptation and mitigation are provided. And in addition to that, we have the UN Habitat in the Planning for Climate Change guide proposing MCA as one of the main techniques that could assess and prioritize different climate adaptation measures. Also, UNFCCC provides, through the Technologies Needs Assessment for Climate Change report, but also through guidelines for developing NAPAs and NAMAs, provides more details and guidelines on how to apply an MCA to support decision making and assessment on different actions. And we see more and more cities also. I have a couple of examples here. We see more and more cities applying this technique to prioritize their long list of possible climate change adaptation actions. Here is an example from the city of Durban, which is quite active in the field of climate change adaptation. This is the report on climate change adaptation planning for a resilient city that was conducted, and there is an MCA application is included, and here we have the different criteria that were identified and used in the assessment process by the local government. Just to name them briefly: impact on risk, to which extent the risk will be reduced by the action, additional benefits, reversible or flexible to different climate change scenarios. What is the impact on emissions? So here the issue of co-benefits, as we discussed before with regard to mitigation, is coming into place. If the action allows for complementary options, the ease of implementation, the institutional complexity, cost-benefit ratio, and risk of maladaptation. As you will see, the process of selecting indicators and criteria is quite flexible and could be different from city to city depending on the priorities of the city. That's one comment. Another comment is you can see that both impact and feasibility related criteria can be incorporated in this stage of selection of criteria. you're not supposed to read this table. It's just to show you the long lists of actions that the City of Durban tried to prioritize and conduct this assessment against the different criteria that we just mentioned before. And here we see many water-related and flood-related actions that were assessed. But it's important to see also to understand the complexity of such a kind of assessment, because for each additional action, the assessment should be done for the impact against each criteria. So the more actions we add, the more criteria we add, the more complex the whole assessment process becomes. This is another example of application of MCA by the City of Vancouver in Canada. So again, we see a kind of diversity of MCA applications between high-income and middle-low-income countries. Those are the criteria for the local climate change adaptation measures that the City of Vancouver used. Again, those are related to impacts like sustainability, co-benefits, effectiveness, risk and uncertainty, opportunity and implementation related criteria. I'm not going into details, but you can look at it when you have the presentation. And to conclude, the main opportunities for using MCA in the climate change adaptation assessment process is that first, allows multiple perspectives and views to be included in the decision making, which in the context of climate change adaptation and uncertainties is very important. In addition to that, MCA could incorporate different measurement scales, qualitative, quantitative, monetary, binary, and translate that in one common measurement scale through normalization technique. Also provides a transparency and structure through the different steps of decision making. It triggers discussion between stakeholders, exchanging views, ideas, objectives through the different stages of MCA, which often could lead to knowledge generation by including also experts in the process. Some challenges, often from different scholars, the high degree of subjectivity has been criticized. By others, it's considered as a positive outcome, but this high degree of subjectivity could lead to manipulation also of the final results. Also, it's difficult to reach consensus on weighting criteria, on identifying and including criteria. So it's quite a challenging process of including and bringing together different stakeholders in the table. Another challenge is the risk of double counting. So it is important to identify well independent criteria that they don't overlap with each other, and it's important to avoid double counting. And this is the final slide on trends and lessons learned, which are the main reasons to apply an MCA in climate change adaptation actions assessment process. The transparency of MCA, the fact that incorporates stakeholders and engage them in a dialogue, could be used as a tool for conflict resolution, and also to integrate in the decision making multiple objectives, which is very important for a holistic approach. We see the use of less complex MCA methods, particularly because decision makers are at the managerial level for urban water or climate adaptation management issues, and therefore they're not experts on this very technical and sophisticated MCA methods. Therefore, less complex MCA methods have the tendency to be used by decision makers. And we see the last year's less development on MCA methods. There are already quite many being developed in the literature, but we see more about integrating different aspects and integrating different techniques within an overall MCA framework. And the last one is that we observe an increasing number of cities using MCA in their climate change resilience adaptation planning for prioritization and assessment, and also MCAs proposed by the UN Habitat benchmark guidelines for climate change adaptation planning. This is also a new guidelines that will be presented also in COP21 in Paris. So I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you very much, Stelios, for this very interesting and inspiring presentation. The first questions already rose up while you were speaking, coming from the conference room beside me. While I will read these questions to you. I invite also those who are connected to us via GoToMeeting to write their questions into the question pane, and then as far as possible we will report on them. So the first question regards the role of stakeholders in this process. And in particular, the question is whether you think that the project cycle of clean development management and joint implementation projects leaves enough space to stakeholders. That means, is it currently structured? Does it give a real opportunity for inclusion and participation?
The question is particularly with regard to projects on clean development mechanism, right?
Yes.
Okay. The clean development mechanism and projects related to clean development mechanism, the first objective, their main objective is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But in addition to that, and as has been laid out in clean development mechanism guidelines, those projects should deliver sustainability benefits for the local governments or the national governments. Therefore, I think MCA, and it has applied also in CDM projects, when we measure multiple sustainable development benefits, is an approach that could really address those multiple benefits through the multiple criteria on one hand, and on the other hand would enhance the participatory approach and inclusion of stakeholders on the development of different CDM projects. So I think that MCA could enhance CDM projects in two ways. The first way is by providing support on assessing the sustainability benefits that this CDM project could generate, and secondly, to include different stakeholders that eventually will be affected by CDM projects. So I do believe that there is a place for MCA to complement the current techniques that has been used to measure the carbon credits generation of CDM projects. And there are already examples in the literature. So yeah, if I could provide a couple of sources on that. Okay. And add that to the relevant literature.
Oh, this would be great, thank you. The next question regards, so as you see, we will put the presentation online, and if you agree, Stelios, so everybody can access your literature list you kindly provided. The next question is regards uncertainty and how uncertainty is treated. Can sensitivity and scenario analysis take into account the full cascade of uncertainty which comes from climate to socioeconomic uncertainty, and leads to an explosion of number of scenarios? So consider, for instance, the different possible combination between RCPs and SSPs, and adding up to that the model uncertainty. Is this computationally feasible in a process like that?
Okay, as the question already entails the complexity of such a kind of approach, like having multiple climate scenarios being combined with multiple socioeconomic scenarios, then resulting in a multiplied number of scenarios. This by itself is a challenging exercise, is a scenario analysis. There are techniques to conduct such a kind of analysis, and this could be combined with MCA. I mean, you could have different scenarios being analyzed and assessed through an MCA. So for instance, I mentioned about alternatives, options, actions. Those could be also scenarios. So comparing future scenarios that capture the level of uncertainty or the possible futures definitely could be a way to incorporate in an MCA process. Of course, it is challenging, technically speaking, to develop those scenarios to start with, right? Therefore, it will be quite challenging also to measure the different impacts against the selected criteria on each different context. So my answer would be that it is technically challenging anyway to come up with all those different possible scenarios. It is possible, though, and it is indeed possible to combine that and integrate that in an MCA model, comparing and assessing the different scenarios.
Okay. Yes, this is very much related to this. You already partly responded to that. Do you think that MCA can also be a technique to be applied on ex post case analysis to better understand and counter challenges, opportunities, and draw more effective lessons learned?
As ex post assessment is also widely applied, so and that would be relatively easier because in that respect, if you have already implemented different actions, you can collect data from the practical application. You can measure to which extent the reduction of risk has been achieved. You can measure any additional sustainability benefits and so forth, and therefore easily could support ex post evaluation and therefore lessons learned out of different climate change adaptation actions implementation. So to compare how different actions practically and finally performed against a selected set of criteria. And this could be also MCA could be and has been used as an ex-ante assessment method, but through the process of implementation, the same set of criteria that were used, let's say, for the ex-ante assessment could be used for the ex-post evaluation. So eventually, indeed, could be used as an ex-post evaluation tool, and there we will have less challenges, less difficulties to get data about the actual performance of the different actions.
Okay, thank you. And now are two very technical questions. The first one is, there are different types of MCA methods, HIP, TOPSIS, or others.
Mm-hmm.
And each measure, each approach generates different outcomes. How do you choose them, the appropriate one?
Right. Okay, this is a very good question because indeed there are different techniques, MCA techniques that support decision making and prioritization, like as well mentioned, analytical hierarchy process, TOPSIS, outranking methods like Promethe, multi-attribute utility theory, so-called MOUT, and so forth. And they have been, all of them, widely applied in different applications. This is quite important, so and very relevant question. One way would be really to see what is the problem at hand, what exactly we want to assess, and which factors we want to take into account. And there are already reviews for what type of problems, which techniques are more appropriate. That's one point. A second point is related to the complexity and challenge of application of the different techniques. So when we talk about decision makers, when we talk about climate change adaptation management, when we talk about water management, in real decision making, so what cities are doing with that, we don't see, and this was one of the main trends and lessons learned, the final slide. We don't see a very sophisticated, complex MCA techniques being used. We see very simple, understandable MCA versions being used by policy and decision makers. Since they don't have the technical capacity and the technical knowledge of MCA methods to apply. That's a second point. So in case of researchers that they want really to provide such a kind of support, then researchers that they have this technical capacity, they could, depending on the type of problem, they could decide different techniques could fit for different type of problems, or different techniques could be applied in combination for one problem, in order to see also, to understand the differences, if there are any differences, and also understand the robustness of the results. Because I think this is an important point. Often we need to explore how valid and robust our results by using one MCA are. Therefore, often, and this has been also proposed in the literature, a combination of different techniques could provide more value to the decision making by just applying one technique.
Thank you. I think this is a very important point, because to my feeling, the more complex the mechanism becomes, the more it moves towards, at least in the perception of stakeholders, towards the black box.
Correct.
And the simpler it is, the easier it is to understand, and that's the real objective of using MCA in working with stakeholders. The easier it is to understand the mechanisms and how the results are generated, I think the more powerful the tool is as a tool of managing democratic or participated processes. So,
correct.
Okay.
Absolutely.
There were there was another bit technical question, which is related more to your experiences with that. Can you give an idea on timescales for these processes of decision making? That will obviously vary, but and connected to that, have these measures in Dhaka been implemented? There's one colleague who is from Dhaka here, so perhaps he will be particularly interested.
So, with regard to the first part of the question, the timelines. So this indeed could vary, and as I said before, the more actions or measures being evaluated and against more criteria, so the higher the number of criteria and actions, the more time is needed to conduct the overall assessment. Particularly the part of scoring, so how the different actions are likely to perform against our criteria. This is quite a time-consuming exercise because we're talking about an impact assessment. This often, depending on the criterion or the type of impact we want to measure, could be from few months to 1 year studying. So studying the likely reduction of risk of certain actions, it's a very technical question that should be answered, and this could take long time. Whereas the inclusion of stakeholders, again, it depends on the level of participation that we want to achieve. But based on our experience in the city of Dhaka, we organized 2 daily workshops, one to identify the evaluation criteria and the objectives that matter, another one for the actual weighting of the criteria, and the third one including different experts providing their judgment for the assessment, which was a relatively quick approach to conduct an experts-based rapid assessment of the different actions against our criteria. So in our case, lasted 1 month to conduct 1 month for the fieldwork, because there was quite a substantial time, few months to prepare that, and of course a few more months to process and analyze the data. So in overall, it takes some months period. From a researcher and analyst point of view, the fieldwork was about 1 month, including those 3 workshops I just mentioned. Now, this study was concluded a few years ago, and as far as I know, because it was initiated by researchers, by us, as far as I know, still there are discussions on which measures to apply, and as far as I know, there is no actual implementation of these actions so far. Whereas in other cases, in the case of Durban and case of City of Vancouver, which was initiated by the local governments, then we have a direct link between the outcomes of the MCA and the actual implementation of measures.
Okay, thank you. As we are actually looking at the Horizon 2020 in these days, the next question is regarding the challenges you mentioned on your last slide. Which are the most promising areas for further research?
Right. So I think one important research area for the application of MCA, I think, is the combination of MCA with other techniques, ranging for cost-benefit analysis, cost-effectiveness analysis, scenario analysis, climate modeling. So how MCA, taking into account the advantages it provides, how could enrich an integrated assessment approach being combined with different tools and methodologies like the ones I just mentioned. This will be quite interesting to see how MCA could contribute to an overall integrated assessment framework. That's one point, somehow technical. On the institutional and governance aspects, would be also important and would merit further research to see to which extent really MCA could engage in actual decision making, different stakeholders, what kind of learning, talking about adaptive management, talking about learning through the process, so to which extent MCA leads to a learning participatory process, learning for different agents and different stakeholders, local government, different actors. So I think exploring the institutional and governance aspects of applying an MCA would also be a topic for further research. So how MCA could be applied in the context of adaptive management and learning process. Just to name two. So one more technical, second more institutional, I would say.
Okay.
And governance.
Okay, thank you very much, Stelios. The last question, which is not one but several questions were put, I know the answer, which is, can we access this slide? I would like to ask Stelios to send us the final version of his presentation, and we will upload it onto the ICCG website, so you can download it from there latest tomorrow. Thank you thank you to Stelios. Yes, please.
May I add a point? I would like, because at the beginning I forgot to mention that this webinar and this presentation has been developed within the framework of Erasmus Mundus European project called Sustain. So I would like to mention that, and you saw the logo
yeah, we saw the logo.
First slide. So I wanted to acknowledge that.
Yeah, it has been visible on the slides. Thank you, and you have a very interesting web page developed within this project. So
right, which I provide also at the end.
And there is a video recording of our webinar, which will be accessible. It's always on the ICCG website. So, no, it's on YouTube, but we will have a link there, so you will can find it on the YouTube channel of ICCG. Okay, thanks to everybody. Compliments to Stelios for this interesting talk, and
thank you for the invitation.
Stay in contact. Goodbye. Goodbye, everybody.
Okay, bye. Bye-bye.